Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're getting into a really compelling framework. It comes from these source materials called Polarities. And it's unusual. It looks at physics, philosophy, and even poetry as like different ways of seeing the same thing. A unified idea of coherence. So our mission here is to take this material, it's dense, but quite beautiful, and kind of distill the operating manual for how balance works in the universe. We're really going to focus on that constant dynamic, between two opposing forces. And crucially, that often missed third element, the bridge, maybe, that provides the stability. Stability for any system, really, whether it's a galaxy or just, your own thoughts, how they thrive.
Right. And that framework, I think, is why this deep dive is so relevant for you listening. We're not just listing definitions here. We're digging for the structural insights. This polarities material, it really gives a clear roadmap, helps understand why some systems work so well, physical systems, biological, social, even psychological ones. Why do some gain resilience, compound their energy, while others just stagnate or fall apart, scatter, really?
Okay, let's unpack that structure then. The source says basically everything in the universe moves between two fundamental tendencies. If you had to boil existence down to just two drivers, what would they be? How does this framework actually define them?
Well, the authors argue it all comes down to the interplay between expansion and containment. These are presented as the universal tendencies.
Yeah,
Expansion is that outward motion, the drive for, freedom, growth, creativity, change. Think of a star forming, maybe, or an idea just taking off. Containment, then, is the opposite. It's inward motion. It brings structure, organization, precision, coherence. It's like the gravity holding planets in their orbits, or, the personal discipline that lets you really focus on something complex.
And the crucial point, which I think gets missed a lot, is that they're not opposed in a fighting way.
Yeah.
Right? They actually need each other.
Yeah.
Like if you have only expansion, pure expansion, you just get chaos. The system dissolves. But if containment wimps completely, you get stagnation. The system locks up. It can't evolve. It dies. It's like the universe is inhale and exhale, always dependent.
Precisely. That's it, exactly. And recognizing that interdependence, that mutual need, brings us to maybe the most vital concept in the whole system. And that's the seam. With a capital S, the seam isn't a physical place, you see. It's described as a state. It's that precise moment, or maybe the exact ratio, where expansion and containment are in this perfect dynamic balance. When energy finds that kind of repeating rhythm, it stabilizes. It actually becomes form. When, say, thought finds that balance, it becomes insight.
I find this idea of the seam really compelling because it feels immediately practical. The authors suggest it's often what's missing when we're trying to achieve high performance. We tend to push for maximum output, that's expansion, or maybe maximum control, which is containment, but we rarely look for that perfect balance point, that seam. So where can we actually spot the seam in daily life?
Oh, it's everywhere once you start looking. It's that stillness you feel right after, say, a complex physical movement, or the momentary calm between your inhale and your exhale. That little pause. It lets the whole system reset itself. In how we behave, it's maybe at the moment after you've been really deeply focused, that's containment, and suddenly, boom, the solution appears. The insight, that's expansion. That clarity where your action and your reflection are perfectly aligned, that is the experience of the seam.
Right.
And this is why it matters structurally, getting back to the why. Systems, galaxies, communities, maybe even just your own well-being, they only stay coherent. They only hold together through this dynamic rhythm. If you lose that rhythm, you either scatter too much expansion, things fly apart, or you just stop evolving. Too much containment, you get stuck. So the goal isn't picking expansion or containment, it's finding the rhythm of the seam.
That makes perfect sense. And it leads us right into another key principle, which the source calls the law of two that births the third. I was a bit surprised, actually, by the emphasis on the number 3. If expansion and containment are the core forces, why isn't it just a simple back and forth, a pendulum swing? Why the third element?
Well, that's where the real magic happens, you could say. Two forces alone, your expansion and containment, they can only really swing back and forth. They define a straight line, constant change, or maybe constant reaction. But the instant you introduce that third stabilizing influence, the seam of the movement is allowed to curve, to arc. And it's that curve, that arc, that actually creates structure. And structure is what allows for continuity, for pattern recognition, and ultimately for memory to form. The O language, as they call it, gives us specific terms for these roles. Expansion, the unfolding tendency, that's PRO, denoted by pi, actually. Containment, the shaping tendency is Kion, denoted by phi. And the seam, that balance point connecting and translating them, is sigma, the Greek letter R.
Okay, I like that framing, unfolding and shaping. That makes the relationship much clearer than just, PRO and con. And if you look around, this triadic pattern, this three-part structure, it really is everywhere, like in physics, right?
Mm.
You have expansion. The initial speed of matter may be plus gravity, which is containment. And that equals a stable orbit, the seam. The orbit is the third thing, the structure that holds the pattern together, or biology. Growth is expansion. Cell walls provide containment. And the result, homeostasis,
Yeah.
the stable internal environment. That's the seam again, the structure stabilizing the change.
Exactly. And the authors use this wonderful analogy of the tree. It's really memorable. The roots hold the earth. That's E-O-N, the containment. The branches reach for sunlight. That's PRO, expansion. And the trunk carries the balance. It translates between roots and branches. That's the seam, sigma. And this leads to one of the deepest insights in the work. Two can move, but only three can remember.
Only three can remember. Okay, that sounds profound, maybe a bit poetic. But how does that translate into, applied physics? What does memory actually mean here?
It connects to what the authors call the geometry of memory. Think of it like this. If two forces just define a straight line, like a transaction that happens and is gone, then introducing the seam allows the system to draw a circle, a stable, curving, repeating pattern. That enduring pattern, that repetition, is what we perceive as rhythm, as pulse, as form. So memory, in this view, isn't just recalling the past. It is the pattern that persists through time. Consciousness itself is even framed as the seam becoming aware of its own rhythm. If a system can't stabilize that tension between PRO and con, between expansion and containment, well, it has no pulse, no structure, and therefore no memory. It just scatters before it can even record its own existence.
Okay, let's try and ground this. We've gone from physics and geometry to memory and consciousness. Now the source makes another big jump. It introduces the Theo lexicon, describing it as the physics of empathy. That feels like a huge leap. How do we get from universal stability to, ethics and human relationships?
It does seem like a leap, but the connection they're making is... well, it's direct, actually. The argument is that human relationships are systems. And like any system, they need coherence to survive, to thrive. So what creates stability in a galaxy, this idea of reciprocal force, is fundamentally the same thing that creates stability in a conversation, which is reciprocal understanding. This lexicon, it just gives us specific terms, a language, to diagnose the health of that human system, the coherence of it. For instance, they talk about the self in relation to the whole system. There's the O-self, that's the individual self, but one that's aware it belongs to everything else, aware that its choices ripple outwards, affecting the whole field. And then there's the Fiode. That's the balanced self, the person who acts calmly, clearly, coherently, even when things are changing or chaotic around them. They've found their internal seam, you could say.
Okay, so O-self is awareness of connection. Fiode is internal balance. What about interactions? What happens when, say, two balanced Fiode selves interact?
That interaction itself is called Pheo. Capital P, capital O. It means reciprocal resonance. It's that state when you're listening so deeply, really translating the other person's perspective so fully, that genuine understanding emerges between you. It's not just taking turns talking, it's actively creating shared coherence, a shared seam, almost.
It really clarifies it. Pheo is the goal for interaction. Now let's get practical, especially when things are difficult. There are two other terms that seem super relevant today, infiote and effipiode. They sound related but opposite.
They are. Infiote, that's I-N fiote, is described as willful rest. It's self-regulation, but achieved through stillness. It's that conscious choice to pause, to reflect before reacting. It's about restoring your own internal seam. It acknowledges that containment, rest, reflection has to come before you can have sustainable expansion or action. And the opposite, the often destructive pattern, is ephipiote. A-P-H-I-piote. This is fragmentation. It happens through overextension, through exhaustion. It's that state of constant output, constant distraction, maybe constant giving without ever taking time for that infiote, that restorative pause. You become completely disconnected from the seam, fragmented.
Yeah, I think most of us can recognize that state of ephipiote, whether it's personal burnout or maybe a workplace that just demands maximum output without investing back in people. The power of having this word, this concept, is that it lets us diagnose it. If a team or an individual is stuck in ephipiote, they are, structurally speaking, fragmenting. They're losing coherence. So the core message seems to be, if we align ourselves with these Pheo ethics, valuing that reciprocal resonance, that Pheo interaction, and also that willful rest in Fiode, we're basically aligning our inner lives with the fundamental physics of the seam.
That's precisely the argument. Empathy is coherence. Coherence is accuracy. Ethics is applied physics. That's the direct quote almost. The moment you act without that reciprocity, without that balance, you introduce dissonance, noise, and the system starts losing energy, losing coherence. If you're operating in a Fiat state, internally balanced, your actions tend to be accurate. They align with reality, with your true intentions, because you're connected to that stable center.
Speaking of energy loss, let's look at the math of it. The source introduces the equation of reciprocity, RP. This isn't just about being fair, is it? It connects back to conservation laws.
That's right. It's about cycles. Energy, information, value, it all has to cycle through a system for it to be sustainable. The equation of reciprocity, RP, is a way to measure the health of that cycle. So if a system could be a conversation, your body and economy gives back more coherence, more energy than it takes in, then RP is greater than 1. That system is amplifying the field around it. It's generative. It's creating surplus resilience, surplus coherence.
And that seems like the key strategic insight, maybe for leaders or even just for ourselves. How do you consciously aim for an RP greater than the 1 in your interactions, in your work?
Well, think about leading a team. If you're constantly recognizing people's contributions, investing in their growth, making sure people have time for that restorative pause, that infiot, then you're likely operating above RP1. The whole system gains momentum, gets stronger. But conversely, if RP falls below 1, fragmentation starts. Energy is being extracted faster than it's restored. You have a net loss of coherence, and that inevitably leads to burnout or debt or maybe even total collapse of the system.
You can see it so clearly in just a simple dialogue, can't you?
Yeah.
If I'm speaking, that's expansion, and I'm also genuinely listening, containment, and we actually reach understanding the seam, then we're probably at RP1 or maybe even higher. But if I just talk at you without listening, just extracting all the attention, my personal RP drops below 1 and the whole exchange just collapses into noise. There's no coherence built.
Exactly. The universe, fundamentally, doesn't seem to tolerate extraction indefinitely. A system has to conserve coherence to survive. And that's why the authors link stability and ethics so directly. They say, what physics calls stability, ethics calls empathy. They're just two different languages describing the same underlying principle, conserving the integrity of the seam.
Wow, okay. That really makes the stakes clear. Now, how do systems learn or evolve? The source mentions learning isn't linear, it happens in spirals. This brings us to the recursion principle.
Right, recursion. It's basically how information or experience feeds back into a system to help it evolve. We cycle back over previous patterns, but the ideal is we do it with new insight each time. And there are two crucial forms of this. First, there's coherent recursion. This is the healthy spiral upwards. It's when the system successfully integrates a new insight, refines its pattern based on that insight, and continues its ascent towards greater coherence. This is how experience becomes wisdom.
Okay, that's the ideal. But then there's the other kind, the dangerous one, dissonant recursion.
Exactly. Dissonant recursion. This often happens when a system is stuck in that fragmented Fiat state. It's when the system just echoes its own errors over and over without any real learning or renewal. Think of that self-sabotaging habit you just can't seem to break, or those recurring cycles of unrest we see in societies. The pattern repeats, but it doesn't integrate the lesson. It just echoes the previous misalignment, the previous mistake, stuck in a loop.
So, if you realize you're trapped in one of those loops, that dissonant recursion, how do you actually break the loop?
The first step is introducing awareness. Awareness acts like that missing pause, that delay. It helps restore the seam internally. Awareness lets you witness the pattern as it starts to happen without automatically falling back into the old reaction. It gives you a moment of choice. But, and this is crucial, awareness by itself usually isn't enough. That realization, that moment of clarity, has to lead to action, to what the source calls PHIOS restructuring, P-H-I-O-U-S restructuring. This means actively translating that inner insight, that newfound balance, into your outer patterns, changing your behavior, redesigning your schedule, your relationships, maybe even the structure of your work, so that they embody this new, more coherent rhythm. You essentially have to rebuild the container to hold the new pattern.
That whole process, that continuous refinement and integration, is mapped out beautifully. And the final concept we should touch on, the ladder of O. But we need to be really clear here. This isn't like a corporate ladder, is it? It's not a hierarchy in the usual sense.
Absolutely not. That's a key point. The ladder of O is described as a spiralic ascent. That means every step, every rung, integrates the lessons and the substance of the ones below it. True progress, in this view, isn't about rising above things, especially not the material world. It's about achieving greater harmony, integrating complexity at a higher frequency of coherence. The rungs themselves just illustrate this progression. They start with matter raw potential, pure expansion maybe, and move up through structure where containment comes in. Then life, mind, culture, eventually reaching consciousness, defined as awareness of awareness itself. Each level is fundamentally defined by its increasing capacity to integrate and hold that dynamic balance of the seam. More complexity held more coherently.
So the core lesson isn't about escaping messy reality, escaping matter. It's about learning to matter differently. It's about integrating more coherence into whatever system you're part of, whether that's your own body, your family, or your culture. Awareness refines itself through the friction of reality, not by trying to escape it.
Precisely. And you see how the levels are interdependent. If a system fails at a higher level, say culture, maybe through widespread opioid, or an RP consistently below 1, that failure tends to cascade downwards. It creates disorder in mind, life, even structure. So the ascent requires coherence across all levels working together.
This has been, wow, a really fascinating journey. From the physics of stability right through to the ethics of our relationships. This deep dive really shows that the universe seems to sustain itself through this constant cycle. O expands, O contracts, and somehow O remembers through that seam. And that rhythm isn't just out there in space. It's in every atom, every thought we have, every action we take. Even just breathing, you're participating in the exact same fundamental pattern that spins the galaxies. The takeaway feels pretty clear. The universe doesn't keep going by achieving some kind of rigid, static perfection. It sustains itself by inviting our continuous, coherent participation. We're part of the process. We are the process, in a way.
And perhaps the ultimate point, the realization of the seam, is when the universe, through us, through consciousness, becomes aware of its own integrity. And that integrity isn't just given, it's something we build moment by moment. So maybe the final thought for you, the listener, is this. If coherence truly is the fundamental law of survival and thriving, how can you consciously ensure that your daily choices, your habits, the systems you design and participate in, your personal routines, your professional structures, how can you make them practical exercises in coherence as a way of being? How do we practice this day to day?